All right, welcome everyone. This is part 3 of our study session of the 14 lessons in Yogi philosophy and Oriental occultism. On your screen, you should be viewing the mysticknowledge.org website under the ebook library -1 page. And there you'll find a section at the very top dedicated to Yogi Ramacharaka. And you can also download for free the text that we are currently reading through, which is the 14 lessons in Yogi philosophy, which is the second book listed there. After we finish this text, we'll go back to the first book there, Hindu Yogi Science of Breath, and then continue on with the advanced course and series and lessons in both Raja, Hatha, and Nani Yoga. Today we will be reading chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 being on thought dynamics, the 5th lesson, and chapter 6 being on clairvoyance, the 6th lesson, and other psychic ability. Let us begin. The 5th lesson, thought dynamics. Had these lessons been written 20 years ago instead of today, it would have been a most difficult task to have awakened the understanding of the Western public to the importance of the power of thought, its nature, its effects. 20 years ago, but comparatively few people in the Western world knew anything about the subject in question. And outside of a few occultists, the words of the teacher would have been regarded as the wildest utterances. But during the time mentioned, the Western world has been slowly educated to at least a partial understanding of the power of thought, and echoes of the great Oriental teachings on this subject have reached the ears of nearly every thinking person in the Western world, this being particularly true of Great Britain and America. This awakening is in accordance with natural laws and is a part of the evolution of the race. It is true that much of the teaching has come from persons who have had but a partial awakening to the truth, and consequently, the teachings have been more or less crude and imperfect, and more or less colored by the personal theories and speculations of the various teachers who have been writing and speaking upon the subject. The average Western student who has been interested in the various movements which may be roughly grouped together under the style of the New Thought has been more or less confused by the apparently conflicting theories and teachings which have resulted from the various speculations and theories of the numerous teachers who have sprung up, grown, and in many cases afterward gone to seed. But a careful analysis will show that underlying all of these teachings are certain fundamental facts which the awakened mind grasps as truth. All of these teachers have done good work, and in fact, the teachings of each have reached certain minds which needed the particular thing taught by the particular teacher, at which teaching was the very best possible, considering the particular stage of development of the student. Many students have obtained much good from certain teachers, and have then grown beyond the teacher and his teaching, and have in turn become teachers themselves, giving forth to others the truth as it came to them, more or less colored by their own personality. The careful student who has taken the trouble to run down the fundamental principles, the teachings of these new schools of thought, will have discovered that they all rest upon the Oriental teachings which reach back beyond written history, and which have been the common property of occultists of all ages and races. This new thought is really the oldest thought, but the modern presentation of it comes as a new thing to those who hear it today. And the new movement is entitled to full credit for its work. But the advanced occultist knows that the fundamental truth lying underneath all of these conflicting theories will be gradually uncovered and brought to light, the speculations and pet theories of the various teachers being thrown aside. The majority of those who read this lesson will have heard something of the subject of the power of thought, and will have doubtless had many experiences to its effect. So this lesson may come as an old story to nearly all the members of the class, but we will endeavor to give a brief, plain outline of the Yogi teachings upon the subject, which may help to reconcile some of the apparently conflicting theories which have been previously considered. We shall not attempt to explain what thought is. That is too complicated a subject for elementary lessons. But we will begin by explaining some of its properties, laws, and effects. We avoid the theory for the time being and get down to the practical side of the question. You'll remember what we said in our last lesson about the aura. We explained that the aura was projected into space by the several principles of man, just as is the light of the sun, the heat of a stove, the odor of a flower, etc. Each of these sources throws off vibrations, which we call light, heat, or odor, respectively. In one sense, these emanations are minute particles of the thing which throws them off. In this connection, we must also remember that the thing throwing off the emanations may be afterward withdrawn, but the emanations still remain for a greater or lesser time. For instance, astronomy teaches that a distant star may be destroyed, and yet the light rays thrown off from it will continue on their journey, and may soon be seen by us of the Earth years and years after the star itself has been destroyed. In fact, what we really see at any time are the rays of the star which left it many years before. The time, of course, depending upon the distance of the star from the Earth. In the same way, a fire in a stove may be extinguished, and yet the heat will remain in the room for a long time afterward. Likewise, a small particle of musk may be exposed in a room and then removed, and yet the odor will be perceptible for a long time. In the same way, thoughts may be in active existence, which have been set out years before by some person, whose entire mental character may have changed, or who, in fact, may have passed out of the body long since. Places and localities are often permeated by the thought of persons who formerly lived there, who have moved away or died many years ago. The mind is continually throwing off emanations, which may be seen as the aura extending a few feet from the person, and which usually becomes thinner and less easily perceived as it extends away from the sender. We are constantly sending forth thought waves, to use a favorite term. And these waves, after the initial force of projection is expanded, float along like clouds, mixing with other thought waves of the same character and extending often to far distant parts of the earth. Some of the thought emanations remain around the place from which they were sent forth, and unless disturbed by strong thoughts of a contrary nature, remain but slightly changed for many years. after thoughts sent forth with a definite purpose or under a strong desire, emotion, or passion, will go forth rapidly toward the object to which they are directed. We shall see instances of this as we proceed with this lesson. The majority of persons put very little force into their thought. In fact, thinking with them becomes almost a mechanical process, and consequently their thought waves have very little motion imparted to them and do not travel very far, unless drawn by some other person of similar thought who attracts them to him. We are merely stating general principles as we go along, repeating them when necessary, so that the student will gradually absorb the idea. We consider this conversational method the most effective form of teaching, far more so than the usual cut and dried form. We wish the student to particularly understand that when we say thoughts are things, we are not using the words in a figurative sense or in a fanciful way, but that we are expressing a literal truth. We mean that thought is as much a thing as is light, heat, electricity, or similar forms of manifestations. Thought can be seen by the psychic sight, can be felt by the sensitive, and, if the proper instruments were in existence, could be weighed. Thought, after being sent forth, is of a cloudy appearance, bearing the color belonging to it, as described in our lesson on the aura. It is like a thin vapor, the degrees of density varying, and is just as real as the air around us, or the vapor of steam, or the numerous gases with which we are acquainted. And it has power, just as have all of these forms of vapor which we have just mentioned. Are you guys unable to see the pages? See if I can improve the video quality. Is that better? In this place, let us mention that when a thought is sent forth with strength, it usually carries with it a certain amount of prana, which gives it additional power and strength and often produces startling effects. The prana practically vitalizes it in some cases and makes of it almost a living force. We will have more to say on this point a little later on. So, friends and students, please remember always that when we speak of thoughts being real things, we mean just what we say. It may be necessary for you to fix this fact in your minds by picturing the mind as sending forth thought emanations. Some find the pictures of the throwing off of light waves an easy way to fix the idea in their minds. Others prefer the illustration of the throwing off of heat by a stove. Others find it easier to think of a flower throwing off a strong perfume. And one student, now far advanced, preferred to think of thought emanations as akin to the stream, as a steam being projected from a boiling tea kettle. Take your choice or invent illustrations of your own, but get the idea fixed in your minds some way. It is much easier to work out these things by means of a material illustration than to attempt to carry out an abstract idea in the mind. You can also download the book that I'm reading from the mysticknowledge.org website under the ebook library -1. link, and you can read along that way if you're not able to see the text clearly through the video. I'm not sure why the bit rate is so low. While, as a rule, the power of thought of a certain kind depends upon the strength with which it has been projected, there is another element of strength, which enables thoughts to manifest power. We allude to the tendency of thought to attract to itself other thoughts of a similar nature and thus combine force. Not only does thought along any lines tend to attract to the thinker corresponding thought attracted from the thought atmosphere within the field of attraction, but thoughts have a tendency to flock together, to coalesce, to blend together. The average thought atmosphere of a community is the composite thoughts of the people composing that community. Places, like persons, have their peculiarities, their characteristics, their strong and weak points, their prevailing atmosphere. This fact is apparent to all who have thought at all upon these lines, but the matter is usually dismissed without any attempt at explanation. But it must be apparent that the place itself is not an entity, and that these characteristics are not inherent in them, but must have some cause or origin. The occultist knows that this thought atmosphere of a village, town, city, or nation is the composite thought of those dwelling in it or who have previously dwelt there. Strangers coming into the community feel the changed atmosphere about it, and unless they find it in harmony with their own mental character, they feel uncomfortable and desire to leave the place. If one, not understanding the laws operating in the thought world, remains long in a place, he is most likely to be influenced by the prevailing thought atmosphere, and in spite of himself, a change begins to be manifest in him, and he sinks or rises to the level of the prevailing thought. In older countries, the characteristics of the leading cities of the nation have grown more or less alike, although there are still many points of difference which the stranger at once feels when he visits them. But in America, where the country is larger and newer, the differences to be noticed in localities are most marked. This is true not only in different sections of the country, but in cities near each other. Let the thoughtful stranger visit in turn the leading cities of the United States, and he will be struck with the spirit of each place, each having its own personality and characteristics. The result of certain lines of thought on the part of the early settlers of the place, which in turn affected the newcomers, who added their thought emanations to the atmosphere of the place, and so on, from time to time, until the several cities have grown further apart in their characteristics and have many different nationalities. Let the stranger visit in turn, say, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver, and San Francisco, and he will notice the greatest differences in the characteristics of each place. This difference does not appear so strongly when he talks to individual citizens, but is quite noticeable when he opens himself up to the spirit of the place. People often speak of these characteristics as the air of the place, and the real explanation has been given above. It is the thought atmosphere of the town. These characteristics may be modified or even greatly changed by a new set of people settling in a town. A few energetic thinkers will send forth strong waves of thought in their everyday life, which will soon color the composite thought of the place. The thought of one strong thinker will overcome the weak, purposeless thought of very many people who send forth only negative thoughts. The positive is a sure antidote to the negative. In the same way, the spirit of the nation is a composite of the spirit of its several parts. If one removes to a town in which the greatest energy is being manifested, he soon feels the effects of the positive thought around him, which awakens similar thoughts within himself. If one removes to a sleepy, dead community, his actions will become deadened, and he will gradually sink to the level of the town. Of course, the man or woman who has built up a strong, positive individuality will not be affected so easily as the one of opposite characteristics. And in fact, he may even act as a leaven for the masses. But in a general way, the average person is greatly influenced by the composite thought atmosphere of the locality in which he spends most of his time. In the same way, dwellings, business places, buildings, etc., take on the predominant thoughts of those inhabiting them, or who have dwelt in them. Some places are notoriously unlucky, and although this condition may be reversed by the man or woman of strong will, the average person is affected by it. Some houses carry with them an atmosphere of sunshine, good fellowship, and good cheer, while others are cold and repellent. A place of business is very apt to reflect the prevailing thought of those at the head of the enterprise or those who direct its affairs. Certain shops inspire confidence in patrons, while others cause one to keep a tight clutch on the pocketbook and a close eye on the clerks. Places in which crimes have been committed often carry with them an unpleasant atmosphere, which originally arose from the strong thoughts sent forth from those participating in the occurrence, both the criminal and the victim. The atmosphere of a person is horrifying. The atmosphere of a prison is horrifying to the sensitive. The atmosphere of a place of vice or scene of low animal pleasures is suffocating to one of higher mental traits. The atmosphere of a hospital is apt to influence those visiting it. The atmosphere of an old church is apt to produce in the mind of the visitor a feeling of quiet and calm. We are speaking in generalities, of course, as there are many influences modifying and changing these tendencies. Thus, it is with individuals. Some carry about them an atmosphere of cheer, sunniness, and courage, while others bring into room a feeling of inharmony, distrust, and uneasiness. Many act as killjoys and as dampers upon enthusiasm and free expression. Hundreds of instances illustrating this fact might be cited, but the student may supply these from his own experience and observation. The various waves of thought sent forth by people attract and are attracted by thoughts of a similar character. They form thought strata in the astral sense, just as clouds fall into groups in the atmosphere. This does not mean that each stratum of thought occupies a certain portion of space to the exclusion of the other thought clouds. On the contrary, these thought particles forming the clouds are of different degrees of vibration, and the same space may be filled with thought matter of 1,000 kinds, passing freely about and interpenetrating without interference with each other, but not assimilating except with thoughts of similar character, although temporary combinations may be formed in some cases. We cannot go into detail regarding this in this lesson, and merely wish to give the student a general idea of the subject upon which he may build from time to time. Each individual draws to himself the thoughts corresponding to those produced by his own kind, and he is, of course, in turn influenced by those attracted thoughts. It is a case of adding fuel to the fire. Let one harbor thoughts of malice or hate for any length of time, and he will be horrified by the vile flood of thoughts which come pouring into his mind. And the longer he persists in the mental state, the worse matters will get with him. He is making himself a center for thoughts of that kind. And if he keeps it up until it becomes habitual to him, he will attract to himself circumstances and conditions which will give him an opportunity to manifest these thoughts in action. Not only does the mental state attract similar thoughts to it, but it leads the thinker into circumstances and conditions calculated to enable him to make use of these thoughts and inclinations which he has been harboring. Let one's mind dwell on the animal passions, and all nature will seem to conspire to lead him into position whereby these passions may be gratified. On the other hand, let one cultivate the habit of thinking higher and better thoughts, and he will in time be drawn into conditions in harmony with the habit of thought, and will also draw to himself other thoughts which will readily coalesce with his own. Not only is this true, but each person will draw to himself other people of similar thoughts, and will in turn be drawn to them. We really make our own surroundings and company by our thoughts of yesterday or today. Yesterday's thoughts influence us to a greater or lesser extent, but today's thought will gradually supplant and drive out the cast-off thoughts of the past if we will that such shall be so. We have said that thought charged with prana manifested a much stronger force than the ordinary thought. In fact, all positive thought is sent forth charged with more or less prana. The man of strong will sending forth a vigorous positive thought unconsciously or consciously if he understands the subject, sends with it a supply of prana proportional to the force with which the thought was propelled. Such thoughts are often sent like a bullet to the mark, instead of drifting along slowly like an ordinary thought emanation. Some public speakers have acquired this art, and one can fairly feel the impact of the thought behind their utterances. A strong, vigorous thinker whose thought is charged strongly with prana often creates what are known as thought forms, that is to say, thoughts possessing such vitality that they become almost like living forces. Such thought forms, when they come into one's psychic atmosphere, possesses almost the same power that the person sending them would possess were he present, urging his thought upon you in an earnest conversation. Those high in occult development frequently send thought forms to aid and help their fellow beings when in distress or need. And many of us have experienced the effect of helpful thoughts sent in this manner, while we did not dream of the cause of the charged feeling which came over us, bringing with it the consciousness of renewed strength and courage. While thought forms are often sent out unconsciously by men of selfish desires and aims, and many are affected by them, we wish to say that there need be no fear of anyone being affected against his own good if he will maintain a mental atmosphere of love and confidence. These two conditions repel the strongest thought wave, which may either be directed against one or which may be encountered in the astral atmosphere. The higher the order of thought, the stronger it is, and the weakest person, providing his mind is filled with universal love and confidence in the one power, is many times stronger than the person of the strongest power who would stoop to use that power for selfish ends. The highest powers of this kind can be possessed only by those of great spiritual development, who have long since left behind them the low aims and ambitions of undeveloped man. Such persons are constantly sending forth thought waves of strength and help, which may be drawn upon by those who need such help. All that one has to do is to make the mental demand for help from those who are able to give it, and at once they attract to themselves the waves of the strong, helpful spiritual thought which is being constantly emanated from the minds of the helpers of the race, both in the flesh and out of it. Were the race at the mercy of those of selfish thoughts, it would have perished long since, but things are otherwise ordered. The only things to be feared in the world of thought forms are those corresponding with any base thoughts which we may be entertaining ourselves. For instance, if we entertain low, selfish thoughts, we are open to thought forms of similar character, which can be lurking in the psychic atmosphere, which may take hold of our minds and urge us on to the doing of things which we would have shrunk from doing in the beginning. We have the right to invite what mental guests we wish. Let us be careful to whom we issue invitations. Our strong desires create thought forms which work toward the gratification of those desires, be they good or bad. We draw things toward us and are drawn toward things by these thought forms. They become powerful helpers and never sleep in their work. Let us be careful how we send them forth. Send forth no strong thought desire unless it meet with the approval of the higher self. Otherwise, you will become enmeshed in the consequences arising from it and will suffer much in learning the lesson that psychic powers must not be used for unworthy ends. You are punished by such things, not for them. Above all, never under any circumstances send forth a strong desire thought to injure another, for there is but one consequence of such an act, and the experience will prove a bitter lesson. Such a person is usually hanged on the gallows he builds for others. Evil thought projected against a pure mind will rebound at once to the sender and will gather force from the impact. We must apologize to our students for laying so much stress on these matters, but as there is always the chance of lessons of this kind falling into the hands of those unprepared to receive them, it is necessary for the warning to accompany anything written on the subject in order to prevent thoughtless persons using the information improperly and thereby injuring themselves as well as others. It is the danger signal displayed by the careless and thoughtless. Those who have made a study of the dynamics of thought are aware of the wonderful possibilities open for those who wish to take advantage of the stored up thought which has emanated from the minds of thinkers in the past and present, and which is open to the demand and attraction of the one who may wish to use it and who knows how to avail himself of it. There has been but little written on this phase of the subject, which fact is somewhat surprising when one considers the wonderful possibilities open to those who wish to take advantage of them. Much thought has been sent forth upon all subjects, and the man who is working along any line today may attract to himself most helpful thoughts relating to his favorite subject. In fact, some of the greatest inventions and most wonderful plans have come to some of the world's great people in this way. Although those to whom they came have not realized from whence their information originated. Many a man has been thinking intently upon a certain subject and has thrown himself open to the outside thought influences which have rushed toward his receptive mind. And lo, the desired plan, the missing link came into the field of consciousness. Unexpressed thought, originally sent out with considerable force of desire, consequently seeks for expression and outlet, and is easily drawn to the mind of one who will express it in action. That is to say, if an ingenious thinker evolves ideas which he has not the energy or ability to express in action to take advantage of, the strong thoughts on the subject which he throws off will for years after seek other minds as a channel of expression. And when such thoughts are attracted by a man of sufficient energy to manifest them, they will pour into his mind like a flood until he seems to be inspired. If one is working upon some problem which baffles him, he will do well to assume a receptive attitude towards thoughts along the same line, and is extremely likely that when he has almost ceased to think of the matter at all, the solution will flash before him as if by magic. Some of the world's greatest thinkers, writers, speakers, and inventors have experienced examples of this law of the thought world, although but few of them have realized the cause behind it. The astral world is full of excellent unexpressed thoughts waiting for the man who will express them and use them up. This is merely a hint of a great truth. Let those make use of it who are ready for it. In the same way, one may draw to himself strong, helpful thoughts, which will aid him in overcoming fits of depression and discouragement. There is an immense amount of stored up energy in the thought world, and anyone who needs it may draw to himself that which he requires. It is simply a matter of demanding your own. The world's stored up thought is yours. Why do not you take it? Right. This concludes chapter 5. The sixth lesson, telepathy and clairvoyance. Telepathy may be roughly defined as the communication of mind with mind, other than by means of the five senses to which material science limits man, viz. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Sight, hearing, and touch being the senses most commonly used. According to material science, it would follow that if two minds were placed beyond the possibility of ordinary sense communication, there could be no communication. And if there should prove to be communication under such circumstances, it would be a reasonable inference that man possessed senses other than the five which have been allotted him or recognized in him by material science. Occultists, however, know that man has other senses and faculties than those taken into consideration by material science. Without going too deeply into this subject and confining ourselves to the purpose of this lesson, we may say that besides the five physical senses, he has five astral senses, counterparts of the physical senses, operating on the astral plane, by which he may see, hear, taste, and even feel without the use of the physical organs usually associated with the use of these senses. More than this, he has a special sixth physical sense, for which we have no English term, by which he becomes aware of the thoughts emanating from the minds of others, even though the other minds may be far removed from him in space. There is one great point of difference between the special sixth physical sense and the five astral senses. The difference is this: the five astral senses are astral counterparts of the five physical senses, functioning upon the astral plane, just as the five physical senses function upon the physical plane, there being an astral sense corresponding with each physical organ, although the astral impression is not received through the physical organ, but reaches the consciousness along the lines of its own, just as does the impression received through the physical channels. But this special sixth physical sense, let us call it the telepathic sense for want of a better name, has both a physical organ through which it receives impressions and also an astral sense counterpart, just as have the other physical senses. In other words, it has an organ just as truly physical as is the nose, the eye, the ear, through which it receives the ordinary telepathic impressions, and which is used in all cases coming under the head of telepathy. The astral counterpart is used on the astral plane in certain forms of clairvoyance. Now, for the telepathic physical organ through which the brain receives the vibrations or thought waves emanating from the minds of others, embedded in the brain near the middle of the skull, almost directly above the top of the spinal column, is to be found a small body or gland of reddish gray color, cone-shaped, attached to the floor of the third ventricle of the brain, in front of the cerebellum. It is a mass of nervous matter containing corpuscles resembling nerve cells and also containing small concretions of gritty, calcareous particles, sometimes called brain sand. This body is known to Western physical science as the pineal gland or pineal body, the term pineal having been given to it by reason of its shape, which resembles that of a pine cone. Western scientists are completely at sea regarding the function, purpose, and use of this organ of the brain. For an organ it is. The textbooks dismiss the matter with the solemn statement, the function of the pineal body is not understood, and no attempt is made to account for the presence and purposes of the corpuscles resembling nerve cells or the brain sand. Some of the textbook writers, however, note the fact that this organ is larger in children than in adults, and more developed in adult females than in adult males, a most significant statement. The yogis have known for centuries that this pineal body is the organ through which the brain receives impressions by the medium of vibrations caused by thoughts projected from other brains, the organ of telepathic communication, in short. It is not necessary for this organ to have an outward opening, as has the ear, nose, and eye, for thought vibrations penetrate matter of the consistency of the physical body just as easily as light vibrations penetrate glass, or X-ray vibrations pass through wood, stone, etc. The nearest illustration of the character of thought vibrations is found in the vibrations sent forth and received in wireless telegraphy. The little pineal body of the brain is the receiving instrument of the wireless telegraphy of the mind. When one thinks, he sets up vibrations of greater or lesser intensity in the surrounding ether, which radiate from him in all directions, just as light waves radiate from their source. These vibrations striking upon the telepathic organ of the brains cause a brain action which reproduces the thought in the brain of the recipient. This reproduced thought may pass into the field of consciousness, or it may remain in the region of the instinctive mind according to circumstances. In our last lesson, Thought Dynamics, we spoke of the influence and power of thought. And we suggest that after finishing the present lesson, the student reread the fifth lesson in order to fix the two lessons together in his mind. In the previous lesson, we told what thought waves did. In this one, we tell how they are received. Telepathy, then, for the purpose of this lesson, may be considered as the receiving by a person, consciously or unconsciously, of vibrations or thought waves sent forth consciously or unconsciously from the minds of others. Thus, deliberate thought transference between two or more people is telepathy. And so, also, is the absorption by a person of the thought vibrations in the atmosphere sent out by other thinkers without any desire to reach him. Thought waves vary in intensity and force, as we have explained in the previous lesson. Concentration upon the part of the sender or receiver, or both, of course, greatly intensifies the force of the sending and the accuracy of the clearness of the receiving. Clairvoyance. It is very difficult for us to speak intelligently on the phenomena coming under the head of clairvoyance without getting into the subject of the astral plane, as clairvoyance is an incident of the astral plane and belongs to that subject. But we cannot go deep into details regarding the astral plane, as we intend to devote an entire lesson to the subject. So we must go on with the subject before us, with the understanding that the students will be given an explanation of the nature and incidents of the astral plane in due time. For the purpose of this lesson, however, we must ask the student to accept the statement that man has within him faculties which enable him to sense vibrations which are not responded to by his ordinary physical organs of sense. Each physical sense has its corresponding astral sense, which is open to the vibrations alluded to and which interpret such vibrations and pass them on to the consciousness of man. Thus, the astral sight enables man to receive astral light vibrations from an enormous distance, to receive those rays through solid objects, to perceive thought forms in the ether, etc. Astral hearing enables one to receive astral sound vibrations from enormous distances, and after a long time has elapsed, the finer vibrations still remaining in existence. The other astral senses correspond to the other physical senses, except that, like the astral senses of seeing and hearing, they are an extension of the physical senses. We think that the matter was well, and rather crudely, expressed to us several years ago by an uneducated psychic who, after endeavoring to explain the resemblance of her astral senses to her physical senses, at last said awkwardly, "The astral senses are just the same as the physical ones, only more so." We do not think that we can improve upon the explanation of this uneducated woman. All persons have the astral senses alluded to, but comparatively few have developed them so that they can consciously use them. Some have occasional flashes of astral sensing, but are not conscious of the source of their impressions. They merely knowing that something came into their mind and often dismissing the impression as an idle fancy. Those awakening into astral sensing are often as clumsy and awkward as is the infant when the physical senses begin to receive and translate impressions. The infant has to gauge distance in receiving impressions through the eye and ear, and also the matter of touch. The infant in psychism has to pass through a similar experience, hence the confusing and satisfactory results and unsatisfactory results at the beginning. Simple clairvoyance. In order to intelligently understand the several forms of clairvoyant phenomena, more particularly those forms which manifest in what we will call space clairvoyance, i.e. the power to see things at great distances, we must accept the fact that we must accept as facts the occult teachings which the latest discoveries of modern physical science are verifying, that all forms of matter are constantly throwing forth radiations in all directions. These astral rays are many times more subtle and fine than ordinary light rays, but they travel in the same manner and are caught up and registered by the astral senses of sight, just as are ordinary light rays by the physical organs of sight. Like ordinary light rays, these astral light rays move on infinitely, and the higher developed and trained astral senses of the advanced occultists register impressions from distances incredible to the average reader who has not studied these matters. These astral light rays penetrate and pass through solid material objects with comparatively no difficulty, and the densest bodies become almost transparent to the trained clairvoyant vision. In all of the several forms of clairvoyance herein noted, there are, of course, various degrees of clairvoyant power on the part of the clairvoyant. Some manifest extraordinary power, others average, and the majority possesses only occasional and more or less rudimentary power of sensing on the astral plane. This is the case with simple clairvoyance as well as with the higher forms, which we will presently describe. Accordingly, one may possess some of the characteristics of simple clairvoyance and lack the others. By simple clairvoyance, we mean the power to receive astral impressions from nearby, the clairvoyant not possessing the power to see distant things or to sense things occurring in the past or present. To the person possessing a full degree of simple clairvoyance, there occurs the phenomena of receiving astral light waves through solid objects. He literally sees things through a stone wall. Solid objects become semi-transparent, and he senses the vibrations passing through them, just as the observer with the proper apparatus senses the X-rays which have passed through a solid object. He is able to observe things transpiring in an adjoining room and behind closed doors. He may read the contents of sealed letters by practice. He may see several yards into the earth beneath his feet and observe the minerals which may be there. He may see through the body of a person near him, and may also observe the working of the internal organs and distinguish the cause of physical ailments in many cases. He may see the aura of persons with whom he comes in contact, observing the auric colors and thus ascertaining the quality of thought emanating from their minds. He may, by clairaudient power, hear things which are being said beyond the range of ordinary hearing. He becomes sensitive to the thoughts of others, owing to the exercise of his astral telepathic powers, which are many times keener than his ordinary telepathic senses. He may see disembodied spirits or other astral forms, which will be explained in the lessons treating that subject. In short, a new world of impressions is opened out before him. In some rare cases, persons possessing simple clairvoyance gradually develop the faculty of magnifying the size of small objects at will. That is, through their astral vision, they are able to adjust the focus so as to bring the astral image of the object before them enlarged to any desired size, just as does the person using the microscope. This faculty, however, is quite rare and is seldom found to have been developed spontaneously. The faculty usually being possessed only by those of advanced and developed occult powers. A variation of this faculty will be noticed under the head of space clairvoyance, which we will take up next. Space clairvoyance. There are several means whereby the psychic or developed occultist may perceive people, things, senses, and events far removed from the observer and far beyond the range of the physical vision. Two of these means will come under the head of this lesson. The other methods belonging to the higher planes of life and being beyond the power of any but the adepts and most advanced occultists. The two methods alluded to come, strictly speaking, under the head of space clairvoyance on the astral plane, and therefore form a part of this lesson. The first of these methods consists of what we have described as simple clairvoyance. On an increased scale, by reasons of the development of the faculty of focusing upon far distant objects and bringing them to view by means of what occultists know as the Astral Tube, which will be described in the following paragraphs. The second method consists of projecting the astral body, consciously or unconsciously, and partially observing the scene on the spot through the astral vision. This method will also be described a little later on in this lesson. We have described the astral light rays emanating from all objects by means of which the astral vision becomes possible. And under the head of simple clairvoyance, we have told you how the clairvoyant may observe nearby objects through his astral vision. Just as he may through his physical sight, the astral light rays being used in the one case, just as the ordinary light rays in the other. But just as one is unable to perceive a far-removed object through his ordinary physical vision, although the light rays are not interrupted, so is the simple clairvoyant unable to see far-removed objects by means of his astral vision, although the astral light rays are uninterrupted. On the physical plane, man, in order to see things beyond his normal vision, must make use of the telescope. Likewise, on the astral plane, he must call into operation some assistance to the simple astral vision in order to receive a clear impression of things far off. This assistance, however, comes from within his own astral organism and consists of a peculiar astral faculty which acts as the lens of a telescope and magnifies the rays received from afar, rendering them sufficiently large to be distinguished by the mind. This power is telescopic in effect, although it is really by a variation of that microscopic faculty noted under the head of simple clairvoyance. This telescopic faculty varies very much in psychics, some being able to see but a few miles, while others receive impressions just as easily from all parts of the earth, and a few have been able to occasionally perceive scenes on other planets. This telescopic astral vision is usually operated in connection with what occultists have called the astral telescope, which is akin to the astral telegraph, astral current, etc., all of which are but variations of the astral tube. The astral tube is caused by the forming of a thought current on the astral plane, held together by a strong supply of prana projected along with the thought, which current renders far easier the passage of astral vibrations of all kinds, whether they be telepathic thought vibrations, astral light vibrations, or astral sound vibrations. It is the bringing of the observer and the observed, the projector and the recipient, or the two persons in harmony, into a close condition of rapport. The astral tube is the means whereby quite a variety of psychic phenomena is made possible. In the case of astral telescopic vision, or space clairvoyance, the clairvoyant either consciously or unconsciously sets up an astral tube connecting him with the distant scene. The astral light vibrations reach him more easily by this method, and the outside impressions are inhibited or shut out, so that the mind receives only the impressions from the point focused upon. These impressions reach the clairvoyant and are magnified by his telescopic faculty, and are then plainly received by his astral vision. This telescopic faculty, remember, acts merely as the lens through which the astral light rays pass, and by which they are magnified to a size sufficiently large to be distinguished by the astral vision, just as the ordinary light rays are magnified for the ordinary vision by the lens of the telescope. The analogy is a very close one and will help you to form a clear mental idea of the process. The astral tube is usually formed by the will of the clairvoyant, or by his strong desire, which has almost as much force At times, however, the conditions being favorable, any idle thought may cause the erection of the astral circuit, and the clairvoyant will see scenes unthought of or even unknown to him. The idle thought may have formed a connection with other psychic currents or have been attracted in certain directions by any of 1,001 psychic causes under the law of attraction and association. But the will of the operator is usually sufficient to shut out the careless adjustments and to establish a speedy connection with a desired person or place. Many persons have this faculty well under control. Others find it coming and going spontaneously. Others are devoid of it except under mesmeric influences, etc. Many have found the crystal ball or similar object an easy means of creating the astral tube, the crystal being used as a sort of starting point. Crystal gazing is merely space clairvoyance by use of the astral tube, the scenes perceived by the observer being seen by this means. We have space merely to state the general principles of this great subject in order to give the student an intelligent idea of the several forms of psychic phenomena. We regret that we have not the opportunity to relate the interesting instances of clairvoyant power which have been recorded by eminent writers on this subject, and which are well attested from a scientific point of view. However, we are not starting to prove the existence of clairvoyance to you. We must assume that you know it to be a fact, or at least not antagonistic to the idea. Our space must be devoted to a brief description and explanation of this phenomenon, rather than to any attempt to prove its reality to skeptics. It is a matter which, after all, every man must prove to his own satisfaction by his own experience, and which no outside proof will establish. The second method of seeing things far removed from us by space consists in the projecting of the astral body, consciously or unconsciously, and practically observing the scene on the spot by means of the astral vision. This is a more difficult and rare method than the ordinary astral tube method just described, although many persons travel in the astral and perceive scenes which they think are seen in a dream or in the mind's eye. We have described the astral body in a previous lesson. It is possible for one to project their astral body or travel in their astral body to any point within the limits of this planet, although very few people are conscious of their ability to so travel, and considerable practice and caution is necessary for the beginner. Once on the spot, the astral traveler may see what is going on around him and is not confined to the small scale to which the psychic using the astral tube is restricted. His astral body follows his desires or will and goes where it is ordered. The trained occultist merely wishes to be at a certain place, and his astral travels there with the rapidity of light, and even more rapidly. Of course, the untrained occultist has no such degree of control over his astral body and is more or less clumsy in his management of it. People often travel in their astral body in their sleep. A smaller number travel unconsciously in their waking moments, and a few have acquired the knowledge enabling them to travel consciously and at will in their waking moments. The astral body is always connected with the physical body by a thin, silk-like astral thread, and the communication between the two is maintained. We will have more to say on the subject of the astral body in our 10th lesson, which treats of the astral plane. We merely allude to it here in order to explain that what is called clairvoyance is sometimes accomplished by its aid, although it is a higher form of psychic power than the other forms of clairvoyance mentioned by us so far. Past time clairvoyance. Time clairvoyance, so far as regards the sensing of past events, is not a rare faculty among advanced occultists. In fact, it may be termed a common one among such people. And the same faculty, imperfectly manifested, is found among many ordinary psychics who are not acquainted with the nature of their power. Among this last mentioned class of people, time clairvoyance is more or less unsatisfactory because imperfect and misleading, from causes which will be seen presently. The statement that one may see past events and scenes, even by astral vision, will readily be seen to require an entirely different explanation from that given of simple and space clairvoyance. For in the latter cases, the clairvoyant sees that which is actually occurring somewhere at the time it is seen, or at least a few seconds previous. Whereas in the latter case, the clairvoyant sees something which has occurred, perhaps ages ago, and often and after apparently all records of it have perished. And that is just the explanation, apparently perished. Occultists know that nothing ever perishes, and that there are in existence on the higher planes of matter imperishable and unalterable records of every scene, act, thought, and thing that ever existed or occurred. These Acoustic records are not on the astral plane, but are on a plane far above it, but they are mirrored on the astral plane, just as the sky and clouds are reflected in the body of the lake, and the observer who cannot see the sky itself may see its counterpart in the water. And just as his vision may be distorted by the ripples and waves on the water, so may the astral vision of these records of the past become distorted and imperfect impressions by reason of the disturbances in the astral light. Occultists for ages have used water as a symbol for the astral light. Do you see why? These Acoustic records contain the memory of all that has passed, and he who has access to them may read the past as he may a book, but only the most advanced intelligences have free access to the records, or rather have the power to read them. But many have acquired a greater or lesser degree of power, which enables them to read more or less plainly from the reflections of those records in the astral plane. Those who have developed time clairvoyance are able to see these reflections of the records as scenes actually occurring before them, just as one hears from the phonograph the voices of people long since passed out of the body, and just as others may listen to our voices centuries hence. It is impossible to explain to beginners the nature of these records. We have no words to explain them. Even we who write these words have but a partial understanding of the inner mystery of the Acoustic records. Then how may we make ourselves plain to those who are still further back on the path than we are? We can think of but one illustration, and that an imperfect one. In the brain of every human being, there are millions of cells, each contain the records of some past event or thought or action. We can find these records by the microscope or by chemical test. We cannot find these records by microscope or by chemical test, and yet they are there and may be used. The memory of every act, thought, and deed remains during life in the brain, although its owner may not always be able to call it up in recollection. Can you grasp the idea of the Acoustic record from this illustration? In the great memory of the universe are registered and stored away the records of all that has gone before. Those who have access to the records may read, and those who are able to see even the astral reflection of the records may read with greater or less accuracy and skill. This is the best we can offer you in the way of explaining an unexplainable matter. Those who are ready for the truth hidden in these words will see a glimpse of it. Others must wait until they are ready. Excuse me a moment. Okay. Future time clairvoyance. Time clairvoyance, so far as seership, or the seeing into the future, is concerned, is even still more difficult to explain. We shall not attempt it, except to say that in the astral light there are to be found faint and imperfect reflections, the workings of the great law of cause and effect, or rather, of the shadows cast before the coming events. Some few have the power of a closer viewpoint of things causing these shadows or reflections, while more have a degree of psychic power, enabling them to see with their astral vision these poor reflections, distorted and uncertain by reason of the waves and ripples of the body of the lake of astral light. There are higher planes of power whereby a few in each age have been able to see partially into the future. But such powers are far above the poor astral plane faculties, which, although quite wonderful to the untrained occultist, are not so highly viewed by those who have progressed well along the path. We almost regret to be compelled to pass over this part of the subject in so few words, and with a mere hint of even the small particle of truth vouchsafed to even the advanced seeker of the way. But we know full well that all will receive the light needed by them, just the moment they are ready, not one moment later, not one moment sooner. All that can be done is for us to drop a word here, a hint there, a planting of the seed. May the harvest come soon and be a rich one. Clairaudience. Clairaudience is the hearing on the astral plane by means of the astral senses. Nearly all that we have said about clairvoyance is equally true of clairaudience. The only difference being that a different astral organ is used. Simple clairaudience is similar to past time clairvoyance. Even future time clairvoyance has a shadow of a resemblance in clairaudient phenomena. The only difference between the two astral manifestations is that they are experienced through two different astral senses. Some clairvoyants are also clairaudience, while others lack the latter power. On the other hand, some hear clairaudiently, but unable to see the astral light. On the whole, clairaudience is a somewhat rare manifestation than is clairvoyance. Psychometry. Just as we may sometimes recall an apparently forgotten thing by seeing something which is associated with that thing in our memory, so may we sometimes be able to open up the astral reflection of the Acoustic records of some particular scene or event by touching some material associated with the event or scene. There seems to be almost an affinity between a bit of matter and the particular portion of the Acoustic records containing the past history of the thing in question. A bit of metal, or stone, or cloth, or hair will open up the psychic's vision of the things previously associated with it in the past. Or, on the other hand, we may bring ourselves in rapport with persons now living by means of a particle of their clothing, hair, or articles formerly carried by them, The rapport condition thus established, enabling us to more easily set up the astral tube. Psychometry is merely one or more forms of clairvoyance brought into operation by means of some connecting link between persons or things, or some object connected with these persons or things. It is not a distinct class of psychic phenomena, but is merely a variation of the other classes, sometimes combining several classes of clairvoyance in its manifestation. Telepathy and clairvoyance. How to develop psychic powers. Just confirm it's the same chapter. Okay. We are often asked the question, which is probably in the minds of the majority of our students, at least those who have not yet manifested any marked exhibition of psychic power. How can one develop the psychic power which is latent within him? There are many methods of such development, a few of which are desirable, many of which are undesirable, and some of which are positively harmful. Among the harmful methods are those in use among certain savage races, and which obtain even among misguided ones of our own race. We allude to such objectionable practices as the use of stupefying drugs, whirling dances, voodoo practices, repulsive rites of the black magicians, and other similar practices which we do not consider it wisdom to even mention. These practices aim to produce an abnormal condition similar to intoxication, and which, like intoxication and drug habits, only result in physical and psychical ruin. Those indulging in them do, it is true, develop a low order of psychic or astral power, but they invariably attract to themselves an undesirable class of astral entities and often open themselves up to the influence of a low order of intelligences, which wise men carefully avoid and refuse to entertain. We will do no more than to utter a warning against these practices and their results. Our work is intended to elevate our students, not to drag them down to the level of the black magicians. Other practices, more or less undesirable, although not absolutely harmful in the sense that we speak of the last mentioned ones, are more or less common among both the Hindus of a certain class and the Western peoples. We allude to methods of self-hypnotization and of hypnotization of others in order to produce or induce a psychic condition in which the person is entitled to catch glimpses of the astral world. Gazing at some bright object until a trance-like condition is induced, or the repetition of some monotonous formula until a drowsy condition is produced, are among the methods of this class. In the same class, we place the ordinary process of hypnotism by others for the same purpose. There is, of course, a higher form of mesmerism known to occultists, which is on an entirely different plane, but occultists are reluctant to use same, except in certain cases where good may result, and such methods are not known to the ordinary operator, who, alas, too often is a person of imperfect occult knowledge and training, and of a low degree of moral character. We caution our students against allowing themselves to be experimented with in this manner. There are two methods of psychic development practiced by the yogis, which we will mention here. The first and highest is the development of psychic powers by first developing the spiritual faculties and nature, when the psychic powers may be used with intelligence and power without any special training. The higher attainment carrying with it the lower. In other words, the yogi, bent on spiritual attainment, contents himself with merely an intellectual acquaintance with psychic powers in passing on. And then after he has acquired the higher spiritual knowledge and development, he returns and uses the tools ready at his hand, the use of which he now understands. In the 14th lesson of this series, we will point out the way of this development. The lesson will be entirely devoted to pointing out the way to spiritual attainment. There is, however, another way whereby some students of the Yogi philosophy develop psychic powers in themselves, preferring to gain this knowledge by experiment and experience before passing on to the spiritual plane. We have no fault to find with this course, providing the student does not regard psychic power as the end of attainment, and providing he always is inspired with worthy motives and does not allow the interest of the astral plane to divert him from the main object, spiritual development. Some of the yogi students follow this plan of first mastering the body of the mind, first mastering the body by the mind, and then mastering the instinctive mind by the intellect under the direction of the will. The first step in the mastery of the body have been spoken of by us in Science of Breath, and will be more clearly brought out and added to in our forthcoming book, Hatha Yoga. The mental control forms a subject in itself, and we trust to find time to write a little manual on the subject sometime during the present year. If the student wishes to experiment a little for himself, we suggest that he acquire self-control and practice concentration in the silence. Many of you have already had exhibitions of psychic power, and you may practice along the lines corresponding to the manifestations you have already had. If it be telepathy, practice with some of your friends and note results. A little practice work wonders for you. If it be clairvoyance, you may practice with a crystal or glass of clear water to assist in concentrating and to form the beginning of the astral tube. If it be psychometry, practice by picking up some object, such as a pebble, a coin, a key, etc., and sit quietly, taking note of the fleeting impressions which at first will come but dimly before your mind. The description of the different classes of phenomena mentioned in this lesson will suggest methods and exercises for you. All right. And that concludes the 6th lesson, Clairvoyance and Clairaudience. Once again, you can download the same ebook that I'm reading from for free on the mysticknowledge.org website on the ebook library-1 link. It is the second book, 14 Lessons in Yogi Philosophy, under the Yogi Brahmacharaka William Walker Atkinson section. Well, thank you very much for your attendance, and look forward to seeing you on Sunday during our open discussion and continued study of the text, The Ancient Language of the Soul, the Mystic Knowledge of Mantra, which you also can find here as well. Written by our teacher, Mr. Nehemiah Davis. We will dive into chapter 9, which is part 1 of a study on the chakra system. And we'll continue with that review of the text, probably for the remainder of the year. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a wonderful evening and weekend.